In Switzerland, there is a particular kind of quiet that feels earned. Clean streets, orderly lives. A country that has long presented itself to the world as a place where things simply work. Binningen is that kind of place. A suburb outside Basel, where neighbors know each other's names, where children walk to school, where a family home means something permanent. And inside one of those homes lived a woman who seemed, by every measure, to be living proof that hard work and beauty and ambition could all exist in the same life at the same time. Then, in February 2024, police arrived at the family home in Binningen. What they found inside stopped seasoned investigators where they stood. Not because they had never encountered violence before, but because of what had been done, deliberately, methodically, within the same walls where two young girls had fallen asleep believing their mother was safe. Long before February 2024, before the police tape and the courtroom and the headlines that cross continents, Kristina Joksimovic was simply a young woman with ambition and the discipline to match it. She was born into a family with Serbian roots, a heritage she carried with pride, and she built her life in Switzerland, a country that rewarded precision, presentation, and hard work. And Kristina had all three. In 2007, she walked onto the regional stage and won the title of Miss Northwest Switzerland. That same year, she stood among the finalists for the National Miss Switzerland crown, a competition watched by the entire country, one that only a handful of women across Switzerland would ever reach. She did not take home the national title, but she left that stage with something that would prove more lasting than a crown, a sense of what she was capable of, and a direction for the years that followed. Because Kristina did not step away from the industry when the pageant spotlight faded. She stepped further in. Over time, she built a second chapter, one she had built entirely herself. She became a catwalk coach, an educator, a mentor to young women who were exactly where she had once been, looking toward a stage and wondering if they had what it took. Former colleagues described her as supportive, precise, and deeply invested in the women she worked with. She did not simply teach technique, she taught confidence. She taught posture, presence, the quiet authority that comes from knowing exactly who you are when you walk into a room. To the women she coached, she was not just an instructor. She was proof that the work was worth it. Her online presence reflected that same energy. She shared her work openly, clips of her students, professional insights, glimpses of the career she had constructed from scratch. To those who followed her, Kristina Joksimovic was a woman still in motion, still building. She married, she became the mother of two daughters. She had woven together the personal and the professional into something that looked, from every visible angle, complete. Marriage, children, a career earning respect in its field, a community that knew her name and valued her presence. And yet, behind the photographs and the professional milestones and the carefully maintained life, there were things Kristina's friends would later say they had begun to notice. A change in the way she spoke about her marriage, a tension that she had tried, quietly and persistently, to resolve. Friends recalled that the relationship had shifted, that the man she had married was not always the man who appeared in the family photographs, that Kristina had tried, through conversation, through therapy, through patience, to find a way through. She had told those closest to her that she wanted a divorce. She had made her decision. And in February 2024, before she could take the next step toward the life she had chosen, Kristina Joksimovic was killed inside her own home. Before she became the center of a criminal investigation, before her name appeared in headlines across the world, she was a daughter, a friend, a mentor, and a mother. She was 38 years old, and she deserved to grow old. There's a particular cruelty in the architecture of a troubled marriage. The walls that are supposed to protect a family become the walls that contain what no one outside is meant to see. The routines, school runs, dinner tables, weekends in the yard, become the structure that holds the image in place long after the reality beneath it has already begun to collapse. To the outside world, Kristina and Mark Reben had built a life together that read, by every surface measure, as stable. A home in Binningen, two daughters, a husband who, by his own later account in court, claimed he loved his wife deeply and envisioned a future with her. That was the image. That was what neighbors saw. By the months leading into February 2024, the marriage between Kristina Joksimovic and Mark Reben had moved well past difficulty. It had become, according to court testimony and prosecution filings, a household operating under the weight of compounding fractures, each one feeding the next. Kristina had made her intentions clear. She wanted a divorce. She had said so. She had asked for financial support. She had raised the question of custody. Who would raise their daughters? Who would be present for the school mornings and the bedtime routines, and the 10,000 ordinary moments that constitute a child's understanding of safety? These were not unreasonable requests. They were the requests of a woman who had decided that the life she was living was no longer the life she was willing to accept, and who was moving, deliberately and legally, towards something different. For Mark Reben, according to prosecutors, those requests landed as something else entirely. Court documents and testimony from friends painted a picture of a man who did not respond to Kristina's decision with acceptance. He was described as controlling, as someone for whom the structure of the marriage, the image of the family, the arrangement of his life, was not something he was prepared to negotiate away. Friends recalled that Kristina had approached the separation carefully, trying to manage the transition in a way that protected her daughters. She had not walked away recklessly. She had enough thought through what she was doing and why, but the financial disputes, the custody tensions, the prospect of losing the household he had built his identity around, these, prosecutors argued, created a pressure inside Mark Reben that he did not know how to carry, and in the months that followed, the temperature inside that home continued to rise. Then came February 2024. There are no photographs of what happened that day, no recording, no witness who saw the door close behind them. What investigators would later reconstruct came from physical evidence, forensic analysis, autopsy findings, and ultimately, in a detail that would shake the courtroom, the testimony of a 6-year-old girl who had been there. Prosecutors would allege that the argument that day followed the same fault lines that had been building for months: the divorce, the money, the children. But this time, it did not end with raised voices or a slammed door. This time, according to the evidence that would later emerge, Mark Reben took Kristina by the throat. He threw her against the wall. And then, according to the autopsy findings and the prosecution's account of events, he strangled her to death with a ribbon-like object in the laundry room of the home they shared. The woman who had spent years building something, coaching others, raising 2 daughters, trying to find a dignified way out of a marriage that had long ago stopped being safe, was gone. What followed was not panic. What followed, investigators would argue, was something far more calculated, and that calculation would become the center of everything that came next. What exactly was said in the moments before Kristina Joksimovic died? What words were exchanged? What line was crossed? What the air in that room felt like in the final seconds is known only by one person. And that person would go on to tell investigators a version of events that forensic science would systematically take apart. Mark Reben's initial claim was that Kristina had attacked him, that she came at him with a knife, that what followed was not murder but reaction, a man defending himself in a moment of fear, a tragedy born from violence that she had initiated. It was a version of events that, if accepted, would have reframed everything. The victim becomes the aggressor becomes the survivor. The investigation shifts its weight entirely. There was one problem: the forensic evidence did not support it. Investigators who examined Mark Reben found no signs of a knife attack on his body, no wounds consistent with the struggle he had described, no physical evidence of an altercation in which he had been the one fighting for his life. What the autopsy of Kristina Joksimovic did find was unambiguous. She had been strangled. Investigators also noted that Reben had been diagnosed by a court-appointed expert with narcissistic traits and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Professor Frank Urbaniak, who had worked as a forensic expert witness for 33 years and overseen 5,000 cases, would later testify that he had reviewed the evidence from this case and found it unlike anything he had encountered before, not because of the killing itself, because of what came immediately after. After Kristina was dead, Mark Reben did not call emergency services. He did not call a family member. He did not sit down in shock on the kitchen floor. He did not do any of the things that a person in genuine crisis, a person who had just accidentally taken a life in a moment of terror, might plausibly do. Instead, according to the prosecution's account, supported by forensic evidence, he went to work. In the laundry room of the family home, using tools that investigators would later catalog with the precision of a hardware inventory, Reben began dismembering Kristina's body. A jigsaw, a knife, garden shears. Prosecutors alleged he had studied human anatomy in advance. That the dismemberment was not the act of a man who had lost control, but of one who had retained it entirely, who understood what he was doing, and who had prepared for the possibility that he would need to do it. He then, according to prosecution filings, used an industrial-grade blender to process parts of her remains before dissolving them in a chemical solution. He also, investigators alleged, removed an organ, an act that would result in a separate charge of desecration of the dead. And this is the detail that Professor Urbaniak would return to in his expert testimony as the one that told him, definitively, the kind of mind he was dealing with. Mark Reben took his two daughters out to dinner. He behaved, according to those who saw him that evening, as though nothing had happened, as though Kristina was simply not there yet, as though the only extraordinary thing about that February night was how ordinary he was making himself appear. The girls were 5 and 6 years old. They ate dinner with their father. Their mother was in the laundry room. When investigators later asked themselves the question that would anchor the entire prosecution, if this was truly self-defense, why was there an elaborate and premeditated cover-up? They were not asking it rhetorically. They were asking it because the answer was already written in the evidence. Because a man who kills in a genuine moment of terror does not reach for a jigsaw. He reaches for a phone. And Mark Reben had not reached for a phone. Not for hours. Not until someone else came looking. It was not the police who first understood that something was wrong. It was a father. Kristina Joksimovic's father became concerned when his daughter did not come to collect her children from school. She had not answered her phone. She had not responded to messages. For a woman described by everyone who knew her as devoted to her daughters, a mother who structured her days around them, this was not a minor irregularity. It was a signal. He went to the house in Binningen. Mark Reben was there. He told his father-in-law that he did not know where Kristina was. It was the same lie he had already told his 6-year-old daughter. Kristina's father did not leave. He searched the house, he went to the laundry room, and when he opened a black bin bag that he found there, he saw his daughter's severed head, still with her hair attached. There are no words adequate to what that moment was. There is no framing that softens it or places it at a manageable distance. A father went looking for his daughter and found what Mark Reben had left behind. He ran from the house, screaming, until a neighbor heard him and called the police. Officers arrived and arrested Mark Reben at the scene. He would later confess, not immediately and not completely, but over the course of the investigation, as the forensic evidence accumulated around him and his self-defense story began to fracture against the physical record. The house in Binningen was secured. Switzerland learned what had happened in Binningen over the days that followed. The story moved fast, first through local Swiss outlets, then across Europe, then across the world. The details that emerged from court documents and forensic reports were so extreme that media organizations and advocacy groups found themselves debating how to cover it responsibly, caught between the public interest in the case and the risk of reducing a murdered woman to the most disturbing facts of her death. Women's Aid, the domestic violence charity, would later release a formal statement expressing deep concern about sensationalist coverage, urging the public and the press to remember that behind the headlines was a real woman, 2 real children, and a family permanently fractured by an act of violence that the justice system was only beginning to address. Kristina's former Miss Switzerland colleague, Krista Ragozzi, spoke publicly. "I'm really shocked," she said. "I'm thinking of her 2 daughters. She was such a beautiful and kind-hearted woman. A woman who had built a career, raised 2 daughters, and tried to leave a marriage safely, had been killed inside her own home. Her father had found her. Her daughters had gone to dinner with the man who had done it. And now, with Reben in custody, and the forensic evidence already beginning to speak louder than any alibi he could construct, the investigation moved toward the question that would consume a Swiss courtroom for years. Not just what had happened, but what Mark Reben had planned, and how long he had been planning it. The trial of Mark Reben moved through the Swiss court system with the weight of a case that had already, in the forensic record and in the public mind, answered its own central question long before a judge was asked to rule. The prosecution's position was precise and consistent from the first day to the last. Kristina Joksimovic had been intentionally killed. She had died from strangulation, controlled, applied force, at the hands of her husband inside their home in Binningen. What followed her death, the dismemberment, the chemical disposal, the blender, the removed organ, the dinner with the children, the hours of silence before anyone came looking, was not the behavior of a man processing shock. It was the behavior of a man managing consequences. The defense held its position to the end. Self-defense, a knife attack, a man reacting to a threat he had not anticipated and could not control. The court had heard the forensic evidence. It had heard Professor Urbaniak's 33 years of expert testimony, his 5,000 cases, and his statement that he had never seen anything like what he was describing in this one. It had heard from neighbors and colleagues and friends who had known Kristina and knew the marriage, and it had heard from a 6-year-old girl, Kristina and Mark's own daughter, who took the stand and told the court that her father was lying when he said he had not meant to kill her mother. A child, who had been there, who remembered, and who, when the moment came, told the truth in front of the people who needed to hear it. In 2026, Mark Reben was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The judge, in delivering the verdict, did not reach for detachment. There are cases, she said, that make fiction become reality. This case has changed our reality. No court ruling can fill the void left by the loss of a loved one. He was also ordered to pay approximately 94,600 Swiss francs to Kristina's 2 daughters, the children who had lost their mother inside the home where they were supposed to be safe, and over 264,000 Swiss francs to Kristina's family, who had spent 2 years carrying a grief that no financial sum could begin to address. For Kristina's family, the verdict was not an ending. It was a confirmation of what they had always known happened inside that house, a confirmation that the system, when pressed with enough evidence and enough persistence, could arrive at the truth. A confirmation that Kristina's daughters would grow up knowing that what was done to their mother was not allowed to go unanswered. But it was not restoration. It could not return a father to the laundry room before he opened that bin bag. It could not return 2 young girls to the version of their lives that existed before February 2024. It could not give Kristina back the divorce she had asked for, the future she had tried to build, the years she had already been planning for when the worst of the marriage was behind her. The justice system had done what it could do. What it could never do was enough. Here is what the headlines could not carry. They could carry the charges, the forensic details, the verdict, the sentence, the name of the man who was convicted, and the name of the court that convicted him, and the number of years he would spend inside a cell while the world outside continued without him. What the headlines could not carry, what they were not built to carry, was Kristina, not the case. Kristina. She was a woman who had taken the spotlight she had briefly stood in and turned it outward, away from herself, toward the young women who came to her not knowing yet what they were capable of. She taught them to walk. But anyone who works in that industry will tell you that teaching someone to walk a runway has almost nothing to do with their feet and everything to do with what they carry in their chest when they step forward. The willingness to be seen, to hold the room, to exist in their own presence without apology. That was what Kristina gave. Former students spoke after her death about what she had meant to them, not as a title, not as a face from a pageant photograph, as a person who had shown up for them, consistently and with genuine investment, in a field that does not always reward that kind of generosity. She was the person you called when you needed someone to tell you that you were capable, and she always picked up. Kristina's case did not happen in a vacuum. In Switzerland alone, domestic violence claims the lives of women at a rate that advocacy groups have described for years as a crisis requiring the country's full attention, not just its sympathy. The Joksimovic case, because of its details and its reach, forced a public conversation that Switzerland had been having quietly in policy rooms and women's shelters and the private offices of therapists and family lawyers, but had not yet been having loudly enough. Women's Aid, responding to international coverage, urged the public to hold the case in its proper context, not as an outlier, not as a story so extreme that it exists in a category of its own, but as the end point of a pattern with warning signs, a pattern that can be interrupted, a pattern that requires communities, institutions, and individuals to decide that the cost of looking away is too high. Kristina had tried to leave. She had done everything that advocates tell women to do. She had spoken to friends, she had sought therapy, she had filed for divorce through the proper channels, she had tried to manage the transition in a way that protected her children. She had done everything right, and she was still killed. That is the part of the story that demands to be carried forward, not the forensic details, not the crime scene photographs, the fact that a woman followed every instruction she was ever given about how to leave safely, and it was not enough, because the danger was in the same house as the exit. Kristina Joksimovic was 38 years old. She was a daughter, a friend, a colleague, a mentor, a mother. She had plans. She had a career she was still building, and children she was still raising, and a future she had already begun to imagine on the other side of the marriage she was leaving. She was not defined by the way she died. She was defined by the way she lived, by the runway she walked at 21, by the students she coached at 30, by the patience she brought to a difficult marriage, by the love she poured into two daughters who will carry her forward into every year she was not allowed to see. The verdict gave her family a word, guilty, and a sentence, life, and a financial acknowledgement that no financial acknowledgement can make right. What it could not give them was her.